When I got closer to the car, I saw him sitting motionless inside the darkness. He wasn't using his phone, and he wasn't doing anything at all. He was simply staring directly at the entrance of my dorm building. Then I noticed what he was slowly turning between his fingers. A small black glass vial. At that exact moment, I realized this was no longer just stalking or some sick obsession. That man was actually planning to kill me. 4 years ago, specifically in the autumn of 2022, I took my first steps as a young, 20-year-old intern at a private chemical pharmaceutical laboratory located on the outskirts of Lyon, France. The training program was designated for a very limited number of graduates. By the end of the first orientation week, we had completely broken the ice by sharing failed experiment results, moments of confusion while adjusting chemical proportions, and personal information that far exceeded the needs of administrative work. The place felt more like a cramped school lab than an advanced medical research facility. We memorized each other's names and faces in just a matter of days. An intern named Bassem stood out among us noticeably from the very first moment. He was clean-shaven, in his late 20s, and moved with excessive confidence and a mysterious charisma, like someone who had navigated a dangerous and terrifying professional life in another corner of the world before deciding to start over with us as a novice intern. He told everyone in the break courtyard that he had worked as a chemist in toxicology labs under the military forensics department and that he was now seeking a civilian degree in medical drug development. Initially, this background granted him an aura of stability and imposing expertise in all of our eyes. He would extend a helping hand to those struggling with chemical ratios and solvents, lean over complex equipment to recalibrate it, and ease the steps, cracking cold, quiet scientific jokes. During the first few weeks, Bassem chose to sit at the far end of the lab's glass hall, next to the centrifuges, with the colleagues interested in solid matter composition. I noticed his presence, of course, but I didn't give him much thought beyond being that former military expert in toxicology. Then, Bassem began to slowly shift his position, heading toward my table. One day, he claimed that the light reflecting off the centrifuges was causing his vision to blur, so he moved an entire workbench closer to my space. In the next shift, he claimed he needed to be near the distilled water tap and moved again. Within a single week, I found him occupying the seat directly adjacent to my chemical table, as if that was his natural place where he belonged from the very beginning. The infiltration was gradual and subtle enough that if I had expressed my resentment publicly, I would have appeared dramatic and overly reactive. However, I noticed that he began to constantly lean over my test tubes, asking me about the basic compounds I was mixing and praising the accuracy of my solution measurements. On their own, those words seemed like normal professional advice, but when put together, they generated a suffocating, heavy feeling that he was intruding into my personal space in a sinister way. During breaks, I would go down the ground floor where the hot beverage vending machine was located to grab a cup of hot chocolate. In a bizarre manner, he was always there at that exact same moment, as if he were walking right behind me. Sometimes I would find him standing ahead of me in the line for the machine. If I sat in the corner of the indoor garden to eat my sandwich, he would bring his chair to sit directly across from me and begin asking strange questions that had nothing to do with drug formulation or acid percentages. Instead, they were sharp, personal questions like, where exactly is your apartment located? Do you live alone in that isolated area? Do you prefer drinks with a bitter almond flavor? I kept my answers highly brief and concise because his sharp, intense focus on the details of my movements made my stomach tighten with an uncomfortable dread. His conversations did not resemble the casual, familiar small talk of colleagues. I felt with all my senses that he was trying to draw a precise, deep map of my lifestyle and daily habits. One afternoon, a violent thunderstorm began, and rain poured heavily just as the shift ended. I was standing behind the glass exit door, scrolling through my phone, pretending to finalize some medical correspondence just to bide a few minutes waiting for the rain to subside. Bassem approached, carrying his protective leather bag, and came close to me, saying in a low tone, "Hey, my car is parked right at the front gate, and I prepared a warm cup of chicory coffee in the cabin. I could drive you home." I told him apologetically. Thanks, but I'm good. I'm waiting for a colleague to stop by and pick me up on her way. That wasn't true at all, but I didn't have enough courage to say to his face, I'm simply terrified of getting into your closed car. He didn't take the hint and didn't back down. He remained standing in his place, blocking a large part of the exit with his broad body, going on about how he was heading to the very same neighborhood I lived in anyway, and that I would catch a severe illness and freeze my limbs if I stayed waiting for that alleged colleague under this cold. He laughed in a muffled tone and said, Come on, I'm not a professional hitman trying to poison you. I'm just a colleague trying to provide medical and humanitarian care. He kept repeating the offer with a sinister persistence, as if I would eventually realize that I was acting foolishly and stupidly by refusing his help. After a few minutes of psychological pressure, I cut him off with a very firm, harsh tone. No, really, I'm fine. Please go with your car now. A sharp, cold spark flashed in his eyes for a second, as if a deep anger had taken hold of him. Then, he forced his lips into a faint smile and muttered, Suit yourself, then, and rushed out into the pouring rain. I felt a weird pang of guilt for confronting him with such coldness, but the feeling of relief that washed over me was far greater than anything else. The next day, before analysis work began in the lab, my training colleague, Claire, slid into the seat across from my table and whispered in my ear, Tell me honestly, is there something going on between you and Bassam? I answered in astonishment. Of course not, why? She looked out of the corner of her eye toward his table and said he had been asking some technicians about the favorite drink I ordered daily from the machine, if I suffered from allergies to certain compounds, and if I took any medications regularly. He didn't ask just once. He repeated the inquiry with an urgency that aroused the suspicion of my colleagues in the department and made them notice. I felt my face grow hot, and it wasn't a good feeling at all. It was a mix of terror and anxiety. I confirmed to Claire that we weren't together and that I barely knew his name from the attendance sheets. Claire showed a look of displeasure and pity, then dropped the subject. But after that situation, I completely stopped answering any personal questions he asked. If he tried to steer the conversation toward the nature of the foods I liked or my free time, I would immediately redirect the dialogue toward chemical reactions and graduation projects, or gather my test vials and leave my table to stick with someone else. About a week later, I was in the research library attached to the lab late at night, around 10 p.m., finishing the examination of a chemical report on one of the large computers designated for analyzing toxins and molecular structures. Normally, this department cleared out completely by 6 p.m., and I knew for certain that Bassam's working hours ended in the afternoon, so there was no logical reason to expect to see him at that late hour. When I got up to bring a scientific reference from the deep chemical reference section, I noticed him sitting at a distant table that had a clear, direct line of sight to my computer and the coffee cup I had left on the table. No laptop was with him, and no scientific references were open in front of him. Just a completely empty table, and he was fixing his eyes toward my table in a terrifying manner. I tried to calm my fears and convince myself that he might be studying here and that he had just happened to zone out in my direction. But when I returned to my seat and glanced over again, he was still exactly as he was, without moving or blinking. No smile, no wave of greeting, just a cold, steady gaze watching me. After a few minutes of pretending to follow the reading of the report while my shoulders were tense and my neck muscles knotted from sheer anxiety, I saved my files in a hurry, shut down the computer, and packed my personal belongings. As I walked out quickly, I sent a short text message to my close friend and Claire. Can you meet me at the entrance of my room in the dorms now? They agreed. I didn't dare turn around to see if he was tracking my steps in the dark hallways or not. I tapped my housing card into the electronic lock of the building, rushed up the stairs, opened the door for them, and let them in on all the details of the eerie monitoring and infiltration I had been subjected to. Expressing those fears and turning them into spoken words made me feel that I was not crazy or suffering from a delusion of paranoia and persecution. The next night, I was tasked with closing the pharmaceutical kiosk attached to the lab outside the facility's boundaries, and I clocked out at exactly 9 p.m. When I cut through the desolate dirt path of the parking lot opposite my dorm, I spotted a dark, old model car parked along the curb, its front and headlights facing the main entrance of her dorm. Its lights were completely off, but the shadow of someone was sitting behind the steering wheel. As my steps drew closer, I recognized the car that always stood in the lab parking lot. Then I distinguished the details of his face accurately in the darkness. Bassam wasn't eating food, and he wasn't talking on his phone. He was fixing his eyes entirely on the metal dorm doors, and in his hand was a small, dark glass vial that he was playing with between his fingers. I kept my gaze fixed on the ground ahead of me, skillfully pretended that I hadn't spotted him, and walked past him heading toward a narrow side alley that twisted to lead to the back gate of the building. I used my magnetic card to open the back door there instead of the exposed front gate. My fingers were visibly trembling over the electronic reading device. As I climbed the internal stairs, I realized clearly that my patience had run out and things had reached their limit. A colleague hanging around and lurking outside my residential building in the dead of night while carrying unknown compounds was a blatant crossing of a red line that I could no longer formulate any logical excuse to justify. The very next morning, I sent an urgent email to the general supervisor of the training program, Dr. Helen, and asked her to schedule an urgent appointment to meet her in her office. Inside her office, I laid out the entire story before her without omission. The story of changing locations in the lab, his tracking of me at the beverage machine, the strange coincidences, the ride offer, and his persistence in it, what Claire had conveyed to me about his questions regarding my medications and allergies, the night in the dark research library, and the black car lurking outside my room at night with the mysterious vial. The woman listened with intense concentration, jotted down notes in her log, and asked me specific, detailed questions. Then she assured me that the lab management dealt with safety and threat issues with extreme severity, and that she would summon Bassam for an immediate investigation. Later that week, Dr. Helen informed me that they had met. Bassam had completely denied any bad intention, claiming that he was acting out of friendliness, professional camaraderie, and the exchange of medical expertise, nothing more, and that I had likely misinterpreted his spontaneous actions due to my lack of experience with military researchers. However, the supervisor explained to me that she had issued him a final, strict written warning, reviewed the lab's general safety and conduct charter with him, and officially warned him against attempting to contact me, or bringing his body close to me outside the framework of necessary analysis tasks documented by the experiment number. For several consecutive days, he kept quiet and clearly stayed out of my way. He returned to sit at the furthest point by the centrifuges and did not direct any word or look at me unless orders forced us to work together on the same sample. My heart rate began to return to its normal pace, and I felt like I was catching my breath again. Then, strange messages began arriving on my personal account. At first, it was a very long and ambiguous text message explaining how deeply his pride was wounded and his feelings hurt because of my complaint, how I had betrayed him and compromised his trust, and that he only wanted to meet me in the lab at night individually to offer me a special drink as a sign of clearing the air and resolving the misunderstanding. When I completely ignored the message and sent no response, he tried messaging me through another social media platform. Then from a new anonymous account accusing me of cowardice and deception, asserting that I would regret refusing his friendship and that compositions can always change. I didn't give him the honor of responding to a single word. I took screenshots of the phone and kept all these messages as physical evidence, showed my friend Claire, and then blocked him from all platforms and means I thought he was capable of using to reach my number. A few days filled with cautious calm passed. One day, Claire and I walked out of the chemical analysis building after the afternoon shift, discussing the division of tasks for a final graduation project on our way to the old bus stop near the city's stone library. The dirt path wrapped tightly behind the stone administration buildings of the lab. I remember very vividly hearing the sound of heavy, additional footsteps walking right behind us at a very slow and steady pace. When I turned my head with a quick glance over my shoulder, the blood froze in my veins as I saw Bassam coming out from behind the corner of the stone building and starting to track our steps at a distance of no more than about 20 feet, holding a small bag designated for preserving toxic samples in his hand. Claire did not stay silent or let the situation pass over quietly. She turned her entire body around, fixed her sharp gaze directly on Bassam's face, and shouted in a loud, powerful voice that echoed through the place for all passersby and technicians to hear. "Bassam, what is your problem? And why are you tracking us like a shadow everywhere with those materials in your hand?" Bassam stopped walking in his place, stared at us for a few seconds with dark, frozen eyes, as if he were studying his next reaction or looking for a suitable moment to spray a substance, then suddenly spun around on his heels and walked away coldly toward the parking lot without uttering a single word. This firm stance was supposed to grant me a sense of security and victory, but on the contrary, it planted a deep terror in my heart of a toxic substance that might hit me unawares. After that public confrontation, the matter in my life turned from a heavy nuisance into a daily hell that I could not live with or endure. I was consumed by a terrifying idea that my food, my drink, or even the air I breathed in the lab might be contaminated with a lethal poison that leaves no trace. I began to map out and plan every step I took inside the facility to ensure my path did not cross his in any way. If I spotted his car in the first parking lot, I parked in the distant lot. If I saw his shadow in the chemical storage hallway, I turned back immediately. I would watch the reflections of faces and objects on the glass windows and test vials to ensure there was no one hiding behind me to put something in my cup. I used to beg my colleagues to accompany me in walking, even if the distance was only a few meters toward the restroom, and I completely stopped drinking from the vending machine. This terrifying psychological pressure began to seep in and erode all other details of my life. It deprived me of stable sleep, destroyed my mental focus, and even my ability to answer the supervisor's normal questions during experiments was severely damaged. I fell behind in preparing my chemical reports, would forget the simplest vital directions, and reread the same written instructions multiple times because my mind was completely captured and engrossed by a single terrifying thought. Is he putting poison in my device now, or waiting for me outside this wall with a lethal substance? My psychological anxiety swelled and reached a dangerous pathological stage where I began to suffer from acute migraines, painful cramps, and a dry throat before entering the lab on the shifts where he was present. After a whole month had passed since my first meeting with Dr. Helen, I fully grasped that things were not moving for the better, and that I could not stay idle waiting for this man to get bored or back down on his own before committing his crime. I immediately headed to the city police headquarters and criminal investigation department, sat inside their cramped investigation office, and recounted to the responsible officer all the events in detail, starting from the first ride offer in the rain and his suspicious questions about toxic allergy compounds, leading up to his tracking of us with the toxic sample bag behind the stone building. They made me write an official, handwritten statement, asked me to specify dates and times accurately, provide the screenshots of the threatening messages, and write down the names of my technician colleagues and Claire, who had witnessed the incident of him tracking us. The officer examined the messages and screenshots carefully, then looked at me with complete seriousness and said that the compositions he was hinting at and the questions about my medications and allergies were classified legally and criminally under the charge of attempted murder via poisoning and dangerous stalking. Hearing those strict criminal terms and the phrase attempted murder from the mouth of a police officer wearing the official uniform had a terrifying effect and a psychological shock that far exceeded the times my friend had described the matter as mere stalking. I felt then that my life was actually on the line. After several days had passed, I received a call from the police informing me that his house had been raided and his bag searched, where they found toxic and restricted chemical compounds that he was not authorized to possess. An immediate criminal arrest warrant was issued against him, and criminal charges were filed that entailed a long prison sentence on charges of possessing lethal materials and attempted poisoning, followed by stalking. After that decision, I never saw Bassam on the lab grounds or in the city again. He was detained behind bars awaiting trial. As the weeks went by, everyone noticed that his seat and workbench in the chemistry section became completely vacant. By the end of the training term, his name was permanently erased from the facility's records and his trace vanished. The lab management did not issue any official statement or clarification of what happened to protect its reputation. But rumors and whispers were circulating among the interns that he had been permanently dismissed and his file transferred to the military forensics department to revoke his chemical license as a result of his blatant violation of legal rules following the strict judicial inspection and the discovery of toxins in his possession. I finished my training course successfully, gathered my certificates, and passed the chemical practice test successfully, but the constant tension and daily, lethal fear of dying poison that I lived through had eaten away at my soul and exhausted my psychological strength to the extent that the laboratory and medical facility no longer seemed in my eyes a place for learning, research, or earning a living in peace and safety. When it came time to renew employment contracts and agree on a new season and engage in a permanent job at the facility, I looked at the application forms and felt a sharp lump in my throat and realized that I could not bear staying for 3 more years in this desolate, enclosed place that reminded me of the smell of death, poisons, and stalking. I submitted an immediate request to transfer to a completely different agricultural and environmental research facility in another city located in the far north. Even though this decision meant paying rent for a new house, bearing additional debts and loans, and starting from point zero with strange researchers and technicians I did not know. It was extremely expensive and full of effort and pressure, but staying in a lab that witnessed all those dark and terrifying events and was a stone's throw away from being the scene of my murder by poison seemed in my eyes 1,000 times worse than any financial loss or hardship of travel. Therefore, I packed my bags and left those outskirts after the end of that year and never thought of returning to them. Now, 4 full years after that terrifying incident, I realized very well, with full awareness, how tragic and bloody the end would have been if I had continued in my foolishness and naive attempts to be polite and kind to a person planning to end my life with poison. He never raised his hand to strike me, and he never shouted a single abusive word at me, but his continuous silent monitoring of my steps, his suspicious personal questions about my medications and bodily weaknesses, and his mysterious vial and car that was lurking in the dark outside my residential room were signs as bright as the sun of a desire to kill and a dangerous pathological criminal mindset. Not just a desire for innocent camaraderie or a harmless, passing interest. I often catch myself thinking about the other victims among the young women and novice interns who might have fallen into his snares and whom he treated in the same terrifying, lethal manner before or after my departure. And I feel grateful and relieved that that official report, the criminal warning, and the raid on his house and discovery of those materials registered in his security record formed a steel shackle for him and prevented him from escalating his actions toward committing a real murder crime that would end the life of an innocent soul. This harsh lesson that I paid for with my youth and nerves taught me clearly to trust my first instincts without hesitation, to set ironclad, strict boundaries for my privacy in front of strangers, to maintain the secrecy of my accounts and places and lock my food and drink containers tightly, and to accept and live with the fact that the terrifying startle and jolt that hits my body whenever I spot an old black car standing on the side of the road, and that suffocating feeling and paranoia that a strange substance might have been put in my cup or that a hidden eye is watching me from behind the curtain to hurt me, may never fade from my subconscious mind for the rest of my life.